Tango and there will be there and there and listen every now and 108 new artifacts making their debut at the exhibit. The most important thing about the artifacts is not what we see, but what we know about them, is the stories they have. You won't believe your eyes when you see these 15 terrifying artifacts recovered from the Titanic. Looking at them will send a chill down your spine and make you rethink going on that cruise you're planning on taking. Join us as we uncover one of the greatest tragedies of all time, piece by piece. Number 15, a love letter. Apart from being one of the most famous tragedies known to man, Titanic has one of the greatest love stories that's associated with it, all thanks to the movie. Even though there's no concrete evidence regarding Jack's existence as he won the ticket as a prize, so there were no records of him boarding the ship, and his and Rose's love story remains ever so tragic. And while we can't revel in the reality of this story, you might be interested to know that love was on board the Titanic. A love letter was found in the ancient artifacts that were recovered almost 70 years after the accident. A Titanic cabin attendant named Richard Geddes penned the letter to his wife. The letter was written on the original Titanic stationery, and it even had its original star-lined envelope when it was found. In addition to the declarations of love, the letter also contained information that only the passengers on the ship would know. In the letter, Richard recounted to his wife a near collision that the Titanic had with the SS City of New York. On April the 10th, just a few days before its collision with the iceberg, the luxury liner almost escaped death and destruction by a hair's breadth. The incident was brought about due to the pull of the ship's propellers tearing apart the ropes of the iron liner. This would bring the ship extremely close to crashing. The collision was averted by the intervention of Captain Smith, who used a tugboat to pull his boat away. Concluding this letter, Richard mentions to his wife how people on board saw this near miss as a bad omen. Number 14, a pocket watch. An antique rusty pocket watch would be recovered from a passenger who had died on the Titanic. The watch belonged to Sinai Kantor, a Russian Jewish immigrant that was aboard the Titanic on that fateful day. The artifact was initially recovered from his body after he was pulled from the icy waters by a recovery operation following the ship's sinking on April 15th. The watch does have a backstory that's worthy of Jack and Rose. Sinai, who was then 34, was traveling on the Titanic with his wife Miriam. The pair were from Russia and boarded the ship with second-class passenger tickets. They had hoped to begin a new life together in America, aiming to study medicine and dentistry once they had settled down in New York City. Sinai was a furrier and planned to sell trunks of furs to find their dreams of a larger-than-life American way. Unfortunately, fate had other plans for them. The married couple would never get a chance to begin their new life together, and as a part of the Women and Children First protocol, Miriam made it safely onto a lifeboat, but Sinai refused to access the boat and, along with thousands of others, was forced into the frigid waters once the ship had sank. His body would later be recovered from the icy water, and this is one of the many stories from the boat that reminds us of the lives involved and the lost in the tragedy. After several days in the cold seawater, the Swiss-made watch is in not perfect shape. The hands have entirely worn away, the dial was stained, and the movement was rusted, and the silver coating was almost completely eroded. Despite being in this condition, the watch actually sold for $57,500 at auction, as it helped to keep the story of the Titanic captivating for more than a century. Number 13, the violin. Now, if you've watched James Cameron's Titanic, you'll surely remember the band playing as the ship went down. But did you know that it actually happened? Yes, it's a real story, and one of the many things that were recovered from the sunken ship was the violin that had played while it was going into the water. After the ship hit the iceberg, an 8-piece band would be commissioned to play music to the loading of the lifeboats to calm the frigid and frightened passengers. Many eyewitnesses would later report that the musicians continued to play until their last breaths, and none of them made it out of the tragedy alive. The most heartbreaking part of the story, perhaps, is that the band leader, Wallace Hartley, his body was pulled from the water just a few days after the Titanic sank, and his violin case was still attached to his back, with one of the rescuers taking it as a souvenir. His body would be brought to England and buried following a funeral procession that brought tens of thousands of people out of their homes to pay their last respects. The bag that contained the violin was found several years after the sinking. Upon investigation, it would be found that the violin belonged to Wallace Hartley. The band members were not part of the ship's crew and had every right to leave and save their own lives. So why didn't they? Well, these musicians had dedicated their final hours to calming the minds and hearts of thousands of passengers that were destined to die on the ship. The ship's chaos was sadly tragic, with the band playing the song "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as the ship sank to the ocean's depths. Wallace's violin would be recovered and returned to his former fiancée Maria, and the violin went on to be purchased by a British collector for an astonishing £1.7 million, and to this day remains one of the most expensive pieces of Titanic memorabilia to ever be sold. The emotions that she must have gone through after hearing the story should be overwhelming to even imagine. The bravery and resilience of Wallace and his band will forever be entrenched in the hearts of the survivors, as well as the rest of the world. Number 12, the Big Piece. Nicknamed the Big Piece, a large section of the Titanic's hull would be rescued from the ocean's depths. But why is a massive chunk of a sunken ship such a big deal? The Big Piece weighs a whopping 15 tons and is a 13 by 30 foot section of the hull. It would first be spotted in 1994, and after a 1996 salvage operation failed when a cable holding the piece had snapped, it was successfully recovered in 1998. This piece of the hull is definitely the largest Titanic artifact ever recovered. Upon closer inspection, it would be found that the piece came from the ship's starboard side, which only proved that the steamer ultimately fell victim to the sheer elemental forces of nature. The portholes still contain their glass, and the big piece remains on display to this day. Standing next to it feels like you're standing next to the Titanic itself. People who visited the exhibitions were in awe of its presence. Many people were moved to tears, and some even claimed that they experienced a tingling when they touched it. Many people feel a greater connection to the Titanic when they look at this enormous piece of the hull. By doing so, the tale becomes more than just a myth. One may observe its impact on many exhibition visitors sitting in the observation rooms. Number 11, the Bell. On April 14th of 1912, around 11:40 p.m., the Titanic is riding the waves just as majestic as ever. The ship's lookout spots a giant shimmering structure, and the man in the crow's nest discovers a massive fleet of icebergs and rings the alarm bell 3 times to alert the staff and passengers of their impending doom. Then many decades later, in 1987, the iconic bell would be recovered and now resides in the Titanic Museum. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, the ship's lookouts, thankfully survived the tragedy and went on to tell their perspective of how things went down. What's actually shocking is that they revealed that they could have spotted the iceberg sooner had they been given a pair of binoculars to assist with their jobs. When asked how much sooner, Frederick replied, enough to get out of the way. After his wife had died, Frederick took his own life on January the 10th of 1965. It can be hard to understand how much the incident affected the lives of everyone who was on board. Just thinking about how everyone on the boat felt after the bell was rung 3 times is impossible to comprehend. Number 10, vials of perfume. On a salvage mission in the year 2000, a leather pouch would be recovered. Salvage expert Dick Barton told ABC News that they could not figure out what they were looking at until they had hit the surface. When they opened up the pouch, something very interesting happened. Opening up the pouch filled the lab with Edwardian perfume. So apparently the pouch had contained 62 small vials of perfume samples that belonged to a 47-year-old perfume maker known as Adolf Saffield, a first-class passenger from Manchester. Saffield fled the ship but left his leather pouch behind to be discovered years later. Several other pouches would be recovered that all had his name on them. And guess what they contained? Well, all the pouches included samples of perfume. After recovering the ship's damages, Saffield's scents were given a second life. The perfume would be broken down into its component chemicals in order to recreate the scent, and led to a perfume that's now called Legacy 1912. And if you're wondering what it smells like, well, they say that it smells like delicate lemon and neuralis, blushing rose, and warm sheer amber. The packaging design would be inspired by a door brought up from the wreck. Number 9, an alligator purse. One of the luxuries of the Titanic was an alligator pocketbook that belonged